I would like to welcome everyone to the latest Distinguished Speakers event. We are honored today to be hosting Senator Sinclair for this event. Professor Frankie Young will be giving a brief introduction to Senator Sinclair. But before we begin that, I would just like to offer a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. Now, Professor Frankie Young, I will pass to you to offer a brief introduction.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sean. Senator Sinclair, we are so delighted to have you here, and I'm honored to introduce you. A little bit of background about Senator Sinclair. Of course, he's no stranger to many of us. But for those of you that don't know Senator Sinclair, he graduated from law school in 1979. And it's important to note that at that time, he entered a profession that knew very little about Indigenous peoples, the history and culture of Indigenous peoples. He practiced law for 9 years and then was admitted to the bench and served the bar in Manitoba for 25 years. And then he was appointed to the Senate. One of his most notable achievements is being chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And he has also, he got appointed to the Senate in 2016, but is now going to be leaving the Senate to focus on Indigenous law. And as we have numerous Indigenous law students here today, I think it's very fitting that you're here to speak to us. Senator Sinclair has won many awards, including the National Aboriginal Achievement Award, the Manitoba Bar Association Equality Award, Distinguished Service Award, and has received honorary doctorates from 8 Canadian universities. Aside from these accolades, I must say, Senator Sinclair, what I would say is one of your most notable achievements as someone that has followed you and looked up to you as a role model is your sense of compassion and your mercy and grace. And I have indicated to numerous people, how does Senator Sinclair demonstrate such compassion? And so we're really delighted to have you here. And at a time in our country when we really have to reconsider our relationship with each other, I can't think of another speaker that could demonstrate that sense of grace and compassion to talk about this important subject. So thank you for being with us, Senator Sinclair.
Well, thank you very much for having me and for inviting me to be part of this very important opportunity to speak with the students and some of the faculty members at Western and engage with University of Western Law School. And also to just continue a dialogue with Canadians that I've been engaged in now for quite a number of years about the process of reconciliation, the process of truth determination, the process of finding an opportunity to move the country in a particular direction, but also finding opportunities to assist young Indigenous people to find their own way in society, because I think that's a key step before we can actually get to mutual respect and reconciliation, which is how we have approached the question of where we go from here. So now, just so we have an opportunity to, there's going to be some time for questions and answers. So as I'm going along, if there's something that strikes you that you'd like to ask about, there's I think a chat feature that's part of this software that we're using that you can utilize, and the questions will be passed along to me. I want to leave as much time as possible for Q&A, because I found that when I was a student, I got more out of the questions and the dialogue around answers that came out of the questions than I did from actually listening to a talking head. But I think there's probably an importance to setting the framework for what it is that we probably need to address today. I know that one of the topics that I was asked to speak to was kind of my own career path and how I got to where I'm at, and to talk about some of the lessons that I learned along the way that helped me move forward in terms of my own career growth. So there might be some lessons in there for all of you as well, particularly for the Indigenous students, but I think for students generally. Let me begin by saying that I never really wanted to be a lawyer. I went to law school because at the time that the thought struck me that I should do that, I was actually working for the Attorney General of Manitoba, who went on to become the Premier of Manitoba, a man by the name of Howard Pauley. Howard was the MLA for our area, and in the course of many meetings that we had while he was an MLA, he asked me one day if I would come to work for him as his executive assistant. And so I agreed to do that. I went to work for him in about 1971, I think, and worked for him for the better part of 5.5 years as his EA. And my work as his executive assistant was essentially to help him with his constituency work, but also to help him in his speeches and help him to work with some of the groups that came to meet with him and prepare him for the meetings that he was attending, etc., and also to help him respond to some of the correspondence that he was receiving. And so it was a pretty broad experience that I gained while I was working for him. And I came to enjoy that life very much. And I came to see that politics was a possible vehicle or an important vehicle by which change could be effected. One of the reasons why Howard and I had come to know each other very well before I went to work for him was because I was quite politically and socially active in the community where I grew up. I was working at the Selkirk Friendship Center, which worked with Indigenous people and advocated for people on behalf of their housing problems, social assistance problems, their child welfare problems, their problems relating to employment. I led a protest movement in Selkirk against the federal government's closure of the local fish plant. I advocated for human rights victims who were taking their complaints to the Human Rights Commission. So I was quite active in the community, and so I always felt a bit frustrated over the fact that there didn't seem to be anybody else who was picking up that cause, but Howard was one of them who did. And so, working closely with him, I found gave me the opportunity to help solve some of the problems with some of the people who had come to me for help while I worked at the center. So that interest in social activism was very strong in me, and very much a part of what I was looking forward to doing while I was in his office. And yet I knew that working for a politician had its inherent limitations, because you were only going to be able to work for him so long as he was holding office. And while the government that he was a member of was elected and re-elected quite a number of times during that era, I always saw that job as really a stepping stone to something else. And Howard and I would talk several times about my going on to university, or back to university, because I had been to university before. I'd gone to university earlier in order to get a teaching certificate and work as an educator. But my focus changed from education to more social and political activism during a lull from university that came about because my grandmother, who had raised me, took ill, and I returned home in order to care for her, and she passed away in 1975. So that at that time, I saw that probably was the time where I had to start to make a decision. So I spoke to Howard, and by that time I had an interest in going into law, not to become a lawyer, but to get into politics. I had seen that a lot of politicians had law degrees, and understanding how law works and how law was developed and the role of politicians in the development of law had become a facet of what I was working with. And so I thought, well, that's something that I want to become involved with. So I went to law school to get a law degree so that I could get involved in politics. I didn't really intend to practice. But I have to tell you that once I got into law and got into debates and arguments with other students, as well as debates and arguments with law professors and with the speakers who came to speak to us, and I was sort of known for my willingness to be a difficult student, so to speak, and my willingness to question people about some of their basic positions and thoughts, and so I enjoyed the advocacy component of being in law school. I actually won an award in law school for civil litigation for being in court. And I liked actually to go to courts and watch lawyers who were practicing law in court and were advocating and were cross-examining witnesses and arguing law. And that really appealed to me. And so I joined the advocacy group within the law school who represented indigent people who were unable to get legal aid assistance or get lawyers to represent them, and we would go down and represent them in court to the best way that we could under the supervision of a lawyer, of course. And so public advocacy within the courtroom sort of became a focus of mine, and I really enjoyed it. And my professors would remind me that I was pretty good at it. So I decided after law school that I was going to become a lawyer for a while and practice law. And so that's what I did. I got into practice and started to represent people in court. And in particular, Indigenous people, because I saw in the course of my law school experience, and even before that, that Indigenous people were not well represented in the court system, generally because most people didn't understand or even respect the circumstances they were facing on a daily basis and what they had to come through in order to just cope with life. And some of the connections that had to why they were involved in the court system to begin with. So most of my clientele were Indigenous. I got involved in advocating for Indigenous rights, hunting rights, treaty rights, fishing rights, and was hired by the chiefs of Manitoba to represent them on land claims negotiations early on in my career. So that by the time I'd been out of law school about 5 or 6 years, most of my practice was mainly in representing Indigenous people and advocating for Indigenous rights and trying to convince judges, and again, arguing with judges most of the time because most of them did not understand. In fact, I think it's safe to say that none of them understood what Indigenous rights were about and what Indigenous people had to experience. And so that led me to a position where I started to help formulate the what is now called the Indigenous Bar Association, and became an advocate for bringing all the Indigenous lawyers in Canada together to see what we could do to strengthen our voice within the institutions of law. So that is where where I was, and I was thoroughly enjoying the practice of law. I had some bad experiences with judges who treated me very poorly. I had one judge who actually thought I was an accused when I first appeared in court. I had police officers when I would go to the cells and interview my clients. I had one police officer who tried to put me in the cell and let my client go because he was a white guy and I wasn't. But those kinds of experiences just made me more determined than ever to see what I could do to affect some change. When I had been out of practice about 7 years, 1987 or so, I received a phone call from the Attorney General of Manitoba, who asked me if I was interested and whether I would be prepared to accept an appointment as a judge of the provincial court. And I said, "Are you crazy? Like, why would I want to go and work with a bunch of guys like that? None of them understand me and none of them I like." So I turned it down. It took 3 efforts on their part. They called a few months later, and then they called again. But this time when they called me again, they were smart enough to engage with Indigenous leaders. And it's the Indigenous leaders who convinced me to become a judge, because they said that somebody's got to open that door. Somebody's got to advocate for more judicial appointments from the Indigenous community. And that's what they wanted me to do, was to get that started. And they said, if you decide to leave after a few years, that's fine, as long as you can get things started in that way. So I accepted it on that basis and went into the provincial court. But then circumstances overtook me. I was appointed a judge on March 3rd of 1988 and sworn in on March the 5th, which was a Friday. I sat in court for the first time on Friday, March the 5th. And then on the following Monday, J.J. Harper was shot on the streets of Winnipeg. J.J. Harper was an Indigenous leader, a very bright young guy who was walking home from an evening out with his friends at the bar. And he was confronted by a police officer who was looking for a teenager who had stolen a car. And using his best racially profiling techniques, the police officer decided to stop every Indigenous guy that he saw, and he stopped J.J. Harper. And J.J. knew his rights, and when the guy said to him, "Get in the car because I want to ask you some questions," J.J. told him, "I don't have to." And then the police officer tried to grab him, wrestle, and ensued. And during the course of that activity, Harper was shot and killed. And that created a pretty big public event, partially because the city of Winnipeg police officer who did it was immediately protected by the city of Winnipeg Police Department. They did not look for any witnesses, although there were some. They did not interview any of the people in the surrounding neighborhood, although there were many people who heard the shot and saw what happened. And they issued a press release within hours of the shooting indicating that Harper had attacked the police officer and that he had tried to grab his gun, and that's the reason that Harper got shot, which didn't sound quite correct. If people knew J.J. Harper well, they knew that he was not that kind of person who would do that. So there was that, and then a newspaper reporter picked up the story and ran with it, and he interviewed the witnesses, and he put the story out, and he pointed out the fallacy of some of the police events, and all of that led to a lot of pressure within a day or two. A few days after that story broke, the government of Manitoba fell in a vote of non-confidence, and an election was called. And during the course of the election, within the first week, the government promised that there would be a public inquiry into that shooting. And they asked me, as a newly appointed judge, if I would chair the inquiry. And I said that I was willing to, but I said I want there to be a non-Indigenous judge who sits with me, because this inquiry is not going to have any credibility with the legal institution if it's only headed by an Indigenous guy. So I said I want to be able to pick the judge who will work with me on this, and they agreed to that. And I asked them to appoint Associate Chief Justice Hamilton of the Court of Queen's Bench to be the co-commissioner. And so the two of us started the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba, and we looked into that case. We were then asked to look into the case of Helen Betty Osborne, who'd been murdered in Nepal in 1971, some 17 years earlier, and whose case and murder had never been solved, even though it was generally known that most of the community knew who the killers were. And so we took up that cause as well. And because there were trials that were going on, and another inquiry looking into the shooting of J.J. Harper, a fatality inquest, we said that while those other things are going on, we're going to hold some general hearings just with the members of the Indigenous community and the general public, to ask them to talk to us about the relationship between Indigenous people and the justice system. And so we did that for about a year and a half before we looked at those two cases. And that led to the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry report, which I think made some very significant findings and had a significant impact upon the public's perception, mainly because of the public hearings that were held, about the public's perception of how our justice system was working. I can remember one judge, in fact, one colleague in the provincial court, came to see me at one point after the report had been finished, and he said, you know, it's really hard for me to say this, he said, but I actually thought there was somebody in charge of the justice system, and your report tells me that really nobody's in charge of the justice system. It just kind of feeds on itself. And so that means that we can't really blame one person. We have to all accept responsibility to change. And so it had a profound impact on many people right from the beginning. But that doesn't mean that the recommendations were implemented. Some of them were, but a lot of the implementation still went unaddressed for a lengthy period of time. But the report itself had an impact upon the Royal Commission into Aboriginal peoples that was held nationally about 3 years later, following the Oka crisis of the early 90s. And I suspect that some of these events that I'm talking to you about right now are probably events that occurred before some of you were born. But if you look up the Oka crisis of the 1991-1992 era, you'll see that it was quite a significant national event, and a national inquiry was called into looking at the causes of that event and what could be done about it. The Royal Commission was created, and they did a study of the justice system as well, and our report was a key component of what they looked at, and I worked with the members of that commission as well. And then I was asked to do another inquiry into the deaths of babies at the St. Boniface Hospital, at the Health Sciences Center here in the city of Winnipeg. And then in 1990, I was then asked to accept appointment to the Court of Queen's Bench, which I reluctantly agreed to because I thought I would be actually moving deeper into the legal judicial career, and I wanted to start to extricate myself from it. But I had started to take on a role of educating judges about the relationship between the justice system and Indigenous people. That was an important activity that I decided I needed to keep doing. So So I moved into the Superior Court, the Court of Queen's Bench in Manitoba in 1991, and 2001, and then was doing that, and was looking to find ways to go back to practicing law when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created, and I was asked if I would chair it. Initially, I said no. And the reason I said no was because, as I told the people who were asking me, I said I did an inquiry into the deaths of 12 babies, and I found that emotionally very difficult. And I don't think I'm ready to do another inquiry looking at things that are as emotionally challenging as this one would be. So I initially said no, but then when they appointed three other commissioners and they couldn't get along and they quit in 2008, then the search team came back to me and asked me if I would reconsider. And I recognized the impact that their quitting had upon the survivors of residential schools and the fact that the survivors felt re-victimized. And so I said I would do it on certain conditions, and those conditions were met, and that's how I got involved with the TRC. But I also want to tell you just a little side note to that, and that is early on in my legal career, after I graduated from law school and started practicing law for a few years, and I mentioned to you about the judge who mistook me for an accused and the police officer who almost arrested me. I became quite frustrated with the way that the justice system was treating Aboriginal people generally, Indigenous people generally, but also treating me. And so I actually decided to quit being a lawyer. I decided to quit law and go do something else. I wanted to leave public life totally because I found it very debilitating and very challenging and overwhelming at times. But before I did, my wife encouraged me to go and talk to our elders. And that's sort of our traditional way of dealing with things like that. And so I did. There was an elder who I had known for many years, who I had come to respect, and I had talked to often about issues. And so I went to see him. His name was Angus Merrick from Long Plains First Nation. I went to see Angus one day, and Angus agreed to meet with me and spent the whole day with me. We drank a lot of tea and burned a lot of tobacco that I had taken to him. While I was talking, he would burn a little bit of tobacco at a time. And I talked with him. I cried a lot during that day and shared with him some of my very deep feelings. It was just him and I sitting in his teepee in the back of his yard. And we talked a long time. And then finally, by the middle of the afternoon, I was all talked out, and he sat there and he thought for a while, and then he said, "So I have something I need to tell you," he said. "If you want to quit being a lawyer, go ahead." He said, you shouldn't do something that's hurting you like that. You shouldn't do something that's going to damage you. That's not good for you. And stop it. If you feel that you can't be the kind of lawyer that you want to be, then don't do it. But remember this, he said, there will be people who know that you know what the law is all about, and they will still come to you for advice. So you should expect that people will still come to you to ask you about questions of law. So there's no getting away from that. But that doesn't mean that you have to be a lawyer. It doesn't mean that you have to go into those places where people are hurting you. But just remember that you will always be a person who knows law. You can't get away from that. But he says, I want you to think about the possibility of being a better lawyer than what they're asking of you in the system. He says, I want you to think about what it would mean if you were the kind of lawyer who not only understood about that system as it presently exists and functions, but I also want you to think about what it would mean to be a lawyer if you also understood what it means to be Anishinaabe. And Anishinaabe is the word that we use to mean ourselves as human beings, as Indigenous human beings. He said, because we have laws too, and you need to understand what they are. And we have ways of doing things and ways of behaving that you have not yet fully learned, and that you need to understand that. You need to learn what it means to be Anishinaabe. And then if you learn that, then you'll be a better lawyer. You need to learn what it means to be a husband. You need to learn what it means to be a father. You need to learn what it means to be a grandfather, because someday you'll be a grandfather. You need to learn what it means to be a good brother to your sisters and to your brothers. You need to learn what it means to be a good friend to all the people. You need to learn what it means to be someone who can help the people when they need help, and who knows when not to try to push the people into doing something that they don't want to do. You need to learn what it means to be a leader. You need to learn what it means to be a follower. You need to learn all of this by learning what our teachings say about this. And you also need to learn how to speak about this in a way that convinces the rest of this country that we are a valid people. And when you do that, he said, if you continue to be a lawyer, you will be the best lawyer that you can be. If you ever become a judge, he said, then you will be the best judge that you can be. And whatever else you do, you will be the best that you could be, so long as you understand all of these things. And so that day I made a commitment that I was going to learn about all of those things that he talked about. I knew some of them, but I didn't know how all of it related to what I was doing as a lawyer. And that made a world of difference. That changed my perspective. That changed the way I did things, and it changed the reason for me to do things. And it also changed my relationship with my children. It changed my relationship with my grandchildren, so that when they were growing up, I immediately knew what it was that they needed from a grandfather, from a mushum. And that's what I tried to be for them. So when you think about how it is that you go about doing your work, you need to understand that part of your responsibility is to ensure that you have a good understanding of your responsibility to the people who are around you. And one of the things that Angus told me during our discussion, he said, someday, he said, you'll probably want to be a leader. Or someday you may have no choice. He said, people will ask you to be a leader. And when they ask you to be a leader, you must remember this: do not try to be a leader unless you love the people. And if you love the people, then you'll be able to lead them. But remember as well, he said, that the people will not always love you, but you have to learn to accept that and be ready to work with that too. Because when you are a leader, sometimes you have to make those difficult decisions and tell them what it is that you think that they must do. So there's a lot that I've spent a long time learning. And as part of the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, one of the things that I wrote about in the report that most people have sort of ignored was that the process that Indigenous people experienced, where they were taken away and put into residential schools, and over and above the abuse that they experienced, was the fact that they were taught that they were inferior, that they were pagans, they were heathens, that they came from a people that had no history, no valid sense of thinking about things, that they had no organization, they had no government, they had no laws, that they were a pitiful people, and that they were lucky that the white man came here and saved them, otherwise they would have become extinct. That's the message that we were given in residential schools. But that very same message was taught to the children in the public schools too, including the white children who were there. And they were taught therefore, not only were Indigenous people inferior, but they were taught that white Europeans were superior. So it was a form of white supremacy that Indigenous children and non-Indigenous children in the public schools had to experience growing up. For many generations, white supremacy has been part of the dialogue. And I call it white supremacy now. At the time, they just talked about it being a sort of nationalism, teaching about being proud to be a Canadian. But that's the same thing, because you weren't Canadian unless you were of European ancestry. And that message was very clear, because no matter how hard I tried in my education, I was top of my class. I got the best marks. I got scholarships to go to university. I was a valedictorian of my graduating class. I was athlete of the year in my high school. And yet, with all of those achievements that I reached in high school, I can remember feeling and believing that none of the white children who I was educated with would have traded places with me, because they always saw me and my family and the community that I came from as an inferior place. And I said that at the 25th anniversary of my high school reunion. And there were some who agreed with me, most didn't, because they were still not aware of how systemic racism works. But that's how it was at that time. And it still works that way even now. So we still have a long way to go. But the reality is that I have come to understand that no matter how hard I try, that I will still be seen by many within Canadian society as something less than others, just because I am an Indigenous man. And I don't have to accept that, and I don't accept that, but it is for me to be aware of that and to challenge that when I get an opportunity. But I also have to accept that it is my responsibility when dealing with non-Indigenous people in conversations about residential schools or about our history, to understand that they themselves have been subjected to their own oppression as well, that they themselves have been misinformed about who they are. Just as Indigenous children growing up in residential schools and in the public schools have been miseducated about who they are, we in turn have been miseducated about who the European children are. We have not been told about our forms of government, for example. When we're told about Canadian history, we're only ever told about Canadian history from 1492, with the arrival of European settlers on the east coast of Canada. We're told about Samuel de Champlain, but we're not told about the Indigenous leaders that he had to deal with and what their thinking was and what their view was. We're not told about the forms of government that he ran into. We're not told about the existence of Indigenous people for 25,000 years before the Europeans came here, and how they were formed and what they thought about. And the anthropologists will tell you it's because they don't know, that there is no written record of it. But the reason they don't know is that they've never come to talk to the leaders who do know, because those stories and those teachings and legends have been passed on from year to year, generation to generation. They're still being taught today. I know now, for example, what our creation story is. And I know about our creation story in relation to the creation story of others. And I know that our creation story is just as valid as their creation story, because every creation story we are taught is true. But at the same time, I know that we had our own laws. We had our own ways of doing things. We had laws about marriage. We had laws about children and child rearing. We had laws about hunting. We had laws about property. We had laws about misbehavior. If somebody hurt somebody, if somebody did something to injure another person deliberately or otherwise, there were consequences that that person had to bear. And there were ways and processes that were in place by which the community held that person accountable. The role of the clans was very important. in ensuring that justice was maintained within the community and fairness, and that people didn't act as though they were simply wild things that took out their vengeance upon others. When you read historians like Diamond Jeunesse and his perspective of things, he really talks about it being almost like a herd instinct, that we were just a primitive form of white men. But that's not the case at all. That we were very sophisticated. We had a much more sophisticated relationship with the land, with other beings of creation, and with each other than Europeans were either prepared to recognize or even understood. And it's time that we started to have dialogue around that. So that's my message to you today, that we need to learn how to respect each other. But let me also point this out to you. In the residential schools and in the public schools, those of us who are Indigenous were taught to believe that we were inferior. And in many ways, we came to believe it. We came to see ourselves as the victims in this conversation, as ones who were not going to be respected and may not even be entitled to respect. But we have to change that. We have to learn about our own self-respect first. And we have to learn that we are a valid people. We have to learn about our own culture. We have to learn about our own teachings because we were denied them for so long. I did not learn about the teachings of my people from my family because my family was heavily influenced by residential schools. I learned about them by going to talk to elders in other places, elders like Angus Merrick and others like him, who taught me what it means to be Anishinaabe. So thank you for listening, and I'll be glad to answer your questions and respond to anything that you might want me to respond to.
Thank you, Senator Sinclair, for such an insightful discussion. I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everyone here today when I say we really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us, and that was a fantastic talk. So thank you again for coming. Sean and I will now open up the floor to some questions. So if you have any questions, you can post in the chat or the Q&A function, and Sean and I will convey them to the Senator. So we already have some questions. So our first question comes from Kelly, and she asked, what meaningful conduct can non-Indigenous law students partake in to help improve our understanding and relationship with the Indigenous community?
Well, probably the most important conduct that non-Indigenous people can undertake essentially is to challenge your own assumptions. And that's, it's like, those kinds of questions make me realize that many people begin the conversation by thinking that you have to convince me, and what can you tell me that will convince me that I am wrong or that where I come from is wrong. But I think there really is an onus on the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous person to examine their own assumptions about things and to look at, in fact, how this whole history, this whole period of time since Confederation, for the most part, in Canada, has ingrained in them a way of seeing things that is just not accurate, and to begin to clear their slate of all of these false assumptions that are being imposed upon them. So the idea, for example, that Indigenous people had no system of governance, the idea that Indigenous people were inferior and were not as sophisticated, that they didn't live in cities, that they didn't know how to farm, that they didn't know how to organize their communities, that they were just kind of small little groups wandering around in the bush, trying not to get lost, and living off rabbits and rats in the bush that they were able to catch and eat. That kind of view of things has been taught to us in our history books, and it has influenced the way that non-Indigenous people see us. And it also has influenced the way that non-Indigenous people see themselves. And the falseness of that, those stereotypes, is probably the biggest area that non-Indigenous people need to begin doing, and that is challenge your own assumptions. Recognize what's false and recognize what you need to think about anew, because we have a lot of work to do, and a lot of that work begins with each individual first.
Thank you, Senator. One of the questions we have from the Q&A is, how do we move beyond sort of paying lip service to Indigenous peoples and make the changes that are necessary to obtain justice and reconciliation and move towards true systemic change?
As a society, what we really need to begin to do is to start looking at the institutions that we have created and the basis upon which those institutions function, and analyze them from the perspective of the extent to which they are systemically biased. Because every institution in this country is layered over with systemic bias over the years. Excuse me, I just have to shut this down. That's my office assistant trying to get a hold of me. That's because I got another event that's going on in about 15 minutes. So one of the things that I think we need to do, just from a straight institutional perspective, is to analyze our legislation, for example, and recognize the fact that when you do an analysis of legislation impacting the lives of Indigenous people going back to Confederation, you can see how organized the approach was by the governments that passed laws to attack and undermine Indigenous people, not only at an institutional level, but also at a personal level. So the establishment of residential schools, for example, was intended to create a child welfare system whereby the government took children away from their parents, not because they were really intent on educating them, but because they were intent on taking them away from the influence of their parents, who they saw as pagans, heathens, and non-Christians, and needed to be raised in a more Christian-like environment, needed to be raised in a way that was more in keeping with how they perceived the white children of society being raised. And so beginning the conversation from that perspective of looking at the way the system is biased is the key to starting this whole conversation. And then you'll understand why, for example, Indigenous people are located in some of the worst lands, even though at the time of Confederation, the only successful farmers in Canada were in areas that had either once been or were Indigenous lands, and that the government systematically, after Confederation, removed Indigenous people from all of the prime agricultural lands in southern Canada and moved them to northern communities where they couldn't farm. And that's a relatively unknown part of Canadian history. So at a time, for example, when the American government set out to destroy the herds of bison upon which some southern tribes are very dependent, those southern tribes had over the many generations had learned to be good agriculturalists, learned how to grow crops, and learned how to depend upon their own agricultural techniques in order to survive. So they weren't relying only upon the bison, but the government, in effect, stopped them from farming and placed them on lands where they couldn't farm, and took their prime agricultural land that they had been farming and gave it to European farmers who were coming here. I always like it when somebody says, you know, well, my great-grandfather came to Canada and he arrived here with nothing, and he pulled himself up by the bootstraps, and now look, we're doing very well. And I say, well, yeah, the reason is because when he arrived here, he was given 160 acres of land by the federal government under the Dominion Lands Act. And that 160 acres was prime agricultural land. And he was given that land for nothing. So he didn't have to pay a dime for it. As long as he farmed it for 10 years, then he got free and clear title to it. And then he could sell it and make money off it, or he could mortgage it and use that money to expand his farming operation. But he did not pull himself up by his own bootstraps. He pulled himself up using the government's bootstraps that they gave him. And on top of all of that, the land that he got was from Indigenous lands that they were using before he came here. Now, I get into many debates in the Senate with some of my colleagues around that point, but the evidence is very clear that that's in fact what happened. If you read the research study done by Sarah Carter at the University of Saskatchewan called Lost Harvest, you'll see exactly what I mean.
Thank you, Senator. We have quite a few questions in the Q&A, so I will try to get through them as quickly as possible, but we're definitely not going to get through all of them. But I just want to say thank you to everyone for being so engaged. We have gotten a lot of great feedback on the talk already. But this next question is just, it's from an anonymous attendee, and they say, what does it mean to you that Canadian law schools are now implementing a mandatory education of Indigenous legal traditions? And what more do you think our Canadian law schools can do to actively further reconciliation?
Well, I think that a lot of the pressure is going to come eventually from the clients themselves, who are going to say, how come you don't know this stuff? To the lawyers who are practicing law. And it's not just the lawyers who are going to be trying to represent Indigenous people, but it's lawyers who are representing the insurance companies, the banks, the oil companies, all of the major players in the Canadian economy, who are going to go to their lawyers and say, well, tell us what are the legal issues that we're facing about putting this pipeline there, or about lending this money to this person, or about paying out this insurance policy to that entity. And the lawyer's going to say, well, I don't know what all the legal problems are. So let me see if I can go find somebody who knows. And the client's going to say, well, how come you don't know? You should know. One of the major changes in understanding the area of Indigenous rights, in fact, has come about because the lumber industry, after years of Indigenous people demonstrating against cutting of timber in the northwest coast of British Columbia, finally the lumber industry said to the government and to their lawyers, we need a better understanding of what those rights are, and we need the government to deal with them properly so that we can be able to do our work effectively. And so it's the clients who are going to eventually put that pressure on, but we can cut them off. And that was part of our call to action in the TRC report, and that is to ensure that every lawyer going to law school and every lawyer who's practicing understands that in this country, there is a unique legal situation in dealing with or relating to Indigenous people that you need to understand and appreciate, and you have to understand you're probably going to run into when you're dealing with Indigenous people. Because Section 35 of the Constitution is beginning to mean something. And if the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People becomes the law of this country, and it could be because the government of Canada now is proposing it, then there will be consequences that will flow from that are going to have an impact upon existing legislation. And lawyers need to understand not only what that is, but why that is.
Thank you, Senator Sinclair. Well, we want to be mindful of your time, and so we're approaching that 2 p.m. So I'd just like to say thank you on behalf of Western, and I know Dr. Alan Shepard would like to offer some words of thanks. So I'll pass to him as well.
Thank you, Sean. Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor to join you, Senator, for your remarks, and also the Western law community far and wide today who've tuned in for this really informative and wonderful opportunity to exchange with you and to hear a bit about the arc of your career. It was extraordinary. A couple of things stood out for me. One was your call for respect on all sides and the importance of that. Seems like a foundational principle. The second, having to do with the perennial question, what can non-Indigenous people do to help forward social justice on these issues? And you're saying to start with your own assumptions and start with your own kind of intellectual training that you've had in your own lives and careers. And the kind of the false assumptions that non-Indigenous communities are taught about Indigenous communities, governance, laws, and so forth. Really, really fascinating. And for me personally, your note about only be a leader if you love the people, even knowing they won't always love you back, but this kind of deep commitment to community. It's been, you're in the middle of a fascinating career, many, many different facets to it over time, and great public service to all of us. And we're very grateful to you, and we thank you for sharing with us some of your story today and calls to action. And real pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you again, Senator Sinclair, and thank you to everyone who has attended. I think this was a great success and very valuable for the whole community.